Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's CSI educational webinar. During this webinar, all lines will be muted, so we ask that you use the question function in the GoToMeeting for all questions. They will be answered at the end of the presentation. Today presenting, we have Helmuth Cote. Helmuth has over 20+ years experience with Infor Cloud Suite Industrial, and he will be presenting on quality control systems, improve productivity, and gain competitive advantage. And with that, I will let Helmuth take it off.
Well, thank you, Elsa. Hi, everybody. I'm Helmuth Cote. Thanks for joining us. Like Elsa just said, we're going to be talking about quality control systems and how you can improve your productivity and gain a competitive advantage using Cloud Suite Industrial. Before we get started here, I'm going to ask you to participate in a couple of polls we're going to put up here. And then we'll get started with the presentation. So you've got one up there that you can see. My company is using QCS. I'm just asking you to put a yes or a no there if you can hit that, kind of help us out understanding who our audience is. All right, we're going to move to the second poll. My company is not using QCS, but is planning to. So I'm guessing we're going to get a 0% on this one, since looked like 100% on the previous one. So that gives me an idea. Just let it sit here for a second. Okay, selecting responses, and we've got it all. Okay, closing the poll. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. All right, so QCS. What are we going to learn today? We're going to talk about some common terms in QCS, and since most of us attending have at least some experience in QCS, this will be a little bit of a review, but that's okay. We'll talk about the 4 components of QCS, or 4 modules of QCS, and how they interact. We'll talk about what I consider to be QCS's best kept secret. We'll translate some of the QCS form names to standard QC, industry standard QC terminology. We'll talk about industry processes and best practices from a quality perspective. We'll look at a first article receiver, what that means. Talk about AQL in QCS and how to manage that. We'll look at instrument and gauge calibration and maintenance in QCS. We'll talk about some of the primary documents in QCS, or vehicles, if you will, the receiver, the MRR, and the car. We'll talk about how to ensure customer requirements are met prior to shipping using QCS. What is a QCS COC? We'll talk about QC Enterprise, probably one of the least understood elements of QC, whether or not you need to implement it. And we'll talk about if you haven't implemented QC or a specific module in QC in phase 1 or phase 2 or up to this point, is it too late? All right. So some of the common terms. A receiver. A receiver is not necessarily tied to something coming off a truck coming into the building, like the name might convey. It's just simply a document used within the QC module to disposition and record the status of items that you have inspected or that you have set up to be quality controlled items within the QC system. 4 different types of receivers. There's the at least 4 different types of receivers. There's a supplier receiver for the QC supplier module, the in process coming off the shop floor, a couple different customer receivers, and then also there are some receivers in the QA section, the QC Enterprise. MRR, Material Review Report. This is commonly, when I'm doing implementations, I commonly get the question, so how does this compare, or how is this different from an NCMR? Well, it's not, actually. It is an NCMR. It's just in QC language ease. It is called an MRR. It can be used to place material on hold, and disposition it later. Can be used to set up secondary inspections on a batch or a lot, and that's the MRR. A CAR, corrective action report. Now, this can be used either as an internal document or can be issued to a supplier as a SCAR, a supplier corrective action report. So this is where I have some information about a reported problem, what we're doing about it, how we found it, the category that it exists in, all the information about a particular event, a QC event, can be stored, related to, or connected to a corrective action report, a CAR. Both MRRs and CARs can also be used to track cost of quality. VRMA, vendor return material authorization. This is a part and parcel of the QC supplier module, but it also links back to accounts payable world. AQL, acceptable quality limits. This helps us have the system handle and manage automatically selecting lot sizes and so forth that we might need to test for an item that requires testing. FAI, first article inspection. You may or may not have a requirement for first article inspection within your organization or your industry. We'll talk about that and how that relates in QC. And supplier equals vendor and vice versa. So you may hear me use supplier and vendor interchangeably, and that's on purpose because as far as QC is concerned, the terms are interchangeable. And an item, what is an item? It's the material being inspected or dispositioned or put on hold or etc. So the four components of QCS. We have QC supplier, which is probably the most common one that gets implemented many times out of the box during phase one of an ERP implementation. QC supplier gets kind of tagged on to that project. QC in process is our shop floor piece of it, and that probably doesn't get implemented during phase one as nearly as often as supplier does. QC customer allows us to handle customer concerns, customer complaints, and manage and control what gets shipped out to customers from a quality perspective. And QC enterprise, which is more of a kind of a QA module, and we'll talk about more of that in a bit. But on top of QC base functionalities, where all of these modules reside, right? So there's some certain base functionality we're going to talk about, go over. So, and how they interact. So you can see right there in the center, we've got QC base functionality, and all around it, we've got QC supplier, QC in process, QC enterprise, QC customer. So let's start with the base functionality. So what do we see in QC base? That's where we...
Helmuth?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you here. It looks like your presentation is not moving if you are clicking it. I'm still seeing your title screen.
Oh, interesting. Thank you for telling me that. Let me stop showing and start showing again.
There we go. Must have been a glitch with our polls there that held you up.
Okay, so you're seeing me move now?
Yep.
Okay. So the good news is, whatever you may have missed from a graphic presentation so far has been pretty boring, but this is the four components of QCS. Again, I'll cover those real quickly, how they sit on top of the base functionality. And this is kind of a all-around approach to it, with QC base functionality sitting in the center, and we're going to talk about QC base functionality. So QC items, that's where we identify an item that is going to be processed through the quality control system. So that's where we put definitions and attributes on the item. We can set them up by module. In fact, not only can, we must set them up by module. So we'll define a specific item's behaviors within QC with regards to the module that it's in, and an item can be in multiple modules. I can have an item defined in supplier and in process and QC customer and RMA. So this is where I say whether an item gets inspected or not, how often it gets inspected. If it is certified, that is, I still want it to be recorded as having come through the QC module, but maybe it goes directly to stock without having to have someone do the interim disposition step. And I can set those definitions by item and by item by vendor or by item by customer as appropriate. This is where I define if an item is required to have tests on it or not and what those tests are. Those tests are organized by methods, severity codes, the equipment required or the gauges required to conduct the tests. And as far as managing those test instruments or test equipment, I can manage the calibration history, see the calibration history of it, the purchase history of those gauges, who manufactured the gauge, within my organization, what department controls and owns that gauge or that test equipment. And then I also have test families, all right? So I consider that probably the best kept secret in QCS. It's not very widely used, and I think that's a shame. It should be. Let's talk about that. So tests and test families. If I don't use a test family, then I have to go into the QC item, define it as being something that requires a test, and then go into the tests and set those tests up. I might have several tests. In this case, I'm showing you an example with two different tests on it. One's a visual test and one's a scale weigh test. On this particular example, this is an in-process type of QC item. And for an in-process type of QC item, I just want to point out that the tests are actually assigned at the operation level. So if I have, 10 operations on a manufactured item, I can have one or many tests per operation. On this example, I've got some tests on operation 20. So what are my options? If I go ahead and don't use test family, then I'm going to be setting these tests up on literally every item that requires testing, or I can use the concept of test family like I have on this other item, the FA10000. I've created a test family there in the center of the screen. You can see it says FA bike test template. And if I go look at the tests on the FA10000, there are no tests set up, but there are tests set up on the test family. So what happens with that is when a receiver is created for the FA10000, the receiver automatically copies in those tests from the test family. So the benefit there is if I want to make changes, I change it in one spot and they automatically get updated, and when a receiver is created, the very latest test gets populated onto the receiver. What else do we see in base functionality? Well, we see the QC general parameters. The QC general parameters define some defaults for me. They tell me how and if I'm going to prompt for reason codes, if I'm going to check failure codes, if they're required or not, or just a notification that they're failure codes. It defines how I handle equipment, how I handle methods, results, whether results are required or not, those sorts of things. That's all at the QC parameters, general parameters, which I consider base functionality. Okay, so now moving away from base functionality, going to move into QC supplier. This is where I would set up QC vendor records. This is where I would tell a system if a vendor is certified, kind of when their last audit date was, when their next audit is due, contact details for this vendor for quality purposes, communication methods, preferred communication methods for this supplier or this vendor. And then also within the QC supplier, we have its own sets of parameters that defines what data displays and when, and what default values I might see for inspecting and dispositioning and doing an RMA or a return. Really, it's used for managing incoming inspections and results and supplier relationships. That's really the purpose for the QC supplier module. And so my transactions there are to disposition, maybe test, conduct testing, do acceptance, dispositioning, put something on hold or reject it, do an inventory move from a quarantined location into inventory or vice versa, scrap it out or do a return and send something back to a vendor on a VRMA. Also within the QC supplier module are the vendor scorecard capabilities. It's built-in, kind of baked into the system. It's points-based, and the vendor gets a score based on their on-time delivery and on rejects. This is an example of what's called the vendor performance report in QCS. This is really what most folks refer to in the vernacular as a vendor scorecard. And the example you can see here, this is all for one vendor, the bicycle parts company. I've got a list of 6 PO lines here, the different items that you can see, the different receivers that were processed and dispositioned as they came in, the quantity from that receiver, the quantity that was accepted, the quality points that were received, which are user defined, by the way. The original due date of the PO, the date it was received. So if we look through here, we can see that the first line was due on 6/7/2017, and it was received on 6/7/2017. So in my system, I've defined they get 75 points for quality points for on time. I'm sorry, for quality points, 25 points for on time. The next line down, it was original due date 7/5. It was actually received on 6/28. So they only got 5 delivery points, and I'm going to show you how that gets calculated. But this is the vendor scorecard, and then you've got a calculated rating at the very end, if it's 100% or if they're 80% or what have you. And then at the very bottom, I see a cumulative, how many receipts, how many points, and what the average was. Bicycle parts company is coming in based on my test data here, my sample data, 93.3333. All right. So kind of what does this mean? How are the delivery points calculated? Again, this is user defined. You set this up. In my system, I have it set up so that if you're an on-time delivery, you get 0 deduction. If you come in early or you come in late, you get points deducted. Now you don't have to deduct for coming in early. I've worked with some of my clients that work in the retail environment, and they actually do get hit if they arrive early or late because they've got a dock time that they have to meet, especially in the retail world. If anybody works with Walmart, if you come in, early or outside that window, it can cost you some money, or it can cost you at least a hit to your performance. So in this example, a PO receipt 5 days early receives a score of 5. That's the 25 points that you get, minus the 20 points for coming in early, coming in 5 days early, and that gives you 5 delivery points out of 25. So you can see the calculation there. So where is this set up in the system? There's a form called vendor rating. And the vendor performance report actually grabs the data from this vendor rating. And this is where I set up what my points for on-time delivery are, and then my early and late deductions. All right, so that was QC supplier. QCM process, moving to QCM process, also ties directly into the base and uses the base functionality. This is our shop floor quality, integrated with factory track. Supports rejecting and scrapping on the fly during production reporting or shop floor reporting. Leverages all the base functionality, the test equipment, inspection frequencies, etc. There are in-process parameters that need to be set up and define what transactional defaults are. The next module we'll talk about is QC Customer. QC Customer is kind of a it's kind of a funny one. It's more than just, it's kind of two sub modules under one module, if you will. So under QC Customer, it leverages, again, all the base functionality that we've seen so far. In other words, it honors item setup, tests, family, gauges, etc. It can control shipments. You see a couple little asterisks there. There's a caveat, and I will go talk about that in a second. And within item setup, apologize for that. Within item setup, there are 4 flags that we can use as kind of alert and default flags. But when it comes to QC Customer, they're more than just alert flags. They're actually functional flags, and we're going to talk about those. So I'm looking at a QC item. I've set this item up as a QC item, QC Customer type item. Again, the FA 10,000, you saw it earlier as a QC in process type item with a reference type of J. Now we're seeing a reference type of O, and we're seeing that the C of C is required. What's that mean to QC Customer? Well, that means if I'm going to ship this out and the parameters are set tightly to control it, then before I can ship this out of pick, pack, and ship, I have to have what's called a certificate of conformance. So we'll get into that in just a second, but it's going to look at this flag to determine that. Okay, so it generates, it requires me to generate a COC. I cannot transact in COC unless, in pick, pack, ship unless I have a COC that I may or may not require a test transaction on. And then it ties the COC generation to the final inspection test. Certificate of conformance, this is what the form looks like to actually create, to generate a certificate of conformance. We can choose to print customer notes, QC customer notes, certificate of conformance notes, internal and external notes, order notes, and even receiver notes. And I can choose to show tests. Here's a COC that I'm looking at with tests that are associated with it. You can see that I know what receiver this particular COC is associated with. I've got there at the top of the receiver 270, and if you look at the bottom, there's a grid that shows me the tests that have been transacted on this receiver. Just above that, in the central area of the screen or the form, there's another grid that are tests associated with this COC. In this case, in this example, there are none. But if there were in either the associated with this COC or associated with this receiver, I could highlight it, click XREF or cross-reference, and would go open up the test and see even more data on that. And this is just an example of the printed output. And if I had tests associated with it that I wanted to print, I would see them here on the bottom underneath all the information. So this is something that you might email or print off and include in your shipment. So why use QC Customer? Why use it to control a shipment? Well, maybe I have a requirement with a customer that's centered around private labeling, or they have a requirement that I'm supposed to print the cert and include that so that they can see the test results, for example. Maybe I have some very specific packaging requirements or specific tests. Maybe I have gone down a road of having a history of sending some bad quality, and so they've put me on a quality program where I have to do one or more of these things in order to get back off that list. Maybe they want to ensure that test results have been performed, so therefore they're saying, show me, print them and show me, or transmit them to me. QC Customers, like the other module, has its own set of parameters, and those parameters are divided up into 3 sections. This is what I consider the sub-modules of QC Customer. That's the shipping, RMAs, and customer complaints. So defaults for how to handle those 3 sets of QC Customer. Okay, so that takes us to the final module of QC, which is QC Enterprise. This is primarily used for organizational quality assurance. What do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is within an organization, you may have quality standards around organizational processes, hiring and onboarding employees, walking through a CapEx approval process, setting up a project to an internal project to maybe do some improvement on your shop floor, or to build a new warehouse, or put in an ERP system. There are some templates built around that. And again, this is QA stuff not related to production, all right? Organizational methods and how we do things, sort of if you have a methodology built around something. Okay, so, you know, what I hear a lot is, okay, so then I don't need QA type stuff in my ERP system, so therefore I don't need QC Enterprise, or do I? Well, there's a couple of elements of QC Enterprise that do relate and directly tie into QC from a production perspective. So one of the selections on QC Enterprise parameters is to calculate AQL for tests. So AQL is acceptable quality limits. This is sampling. So if I'm going to do a test and I want the system to look at historical references of rejected or QC receivers I've brought in and I've rejected and so forth, I want the system to make a recommendation to me for the sampling size that I should be looking at for a particular receipt. You know, I've got a receipt of 100 coming in, and maybe I want the system to say, out of that 100, based on historical results, you should sample 10 of them, or you should sample 2 of them, or whatever that is. If I want that to be done for me in the system, then I have to use AQL, and I have to turn this on in QC Enterprise, which means I have to have a license for QC Enterprise to do that. If I have a requirement for first article receivers, again, the only way I can get a first article receiver is by being licensed for QC Enterprise and turning the flag on in the Enterprise parameters. So it integrates with QC Supplier, it integrates with In Process. It leverages all of the QC item setup, and it uses that other flag that I showed you in the QC item that says first article. So if I have a first article created there, check mark there, then I can expect the system to generate for me a first article receiver, or an FAI receiver. And so what's that mean? A first article receiver differs from a normal receiver in really only one way. A normal receiver, I can record tests against, and then in order to finish the process, I have to disposition it, either say that I've accepted the goods on it, or put them on hold for further review, or I have rejected them. With a first article receiver, I can record tests on it, but I cannot disposition a first article receiver, all right? So I can actually get 2 receivers for the same lot or the same batch. One's a first article that I do tests against, and then the other would be one that I actually disposition and allow me to move the material into an area either for quarantine or for production or for shipment. QC Enterprise AQL. So there are 2 different forms within QC that really touch AQL and help me calculate. One's the sampling criterias, where I define the number of receivers, and then the number of receivers that equate to a criteria for loosened or a criteria for tightened. And then another form that takes that loosened or tightened status and says, okay, based on what I've received, what's the quantity that is loosened, or the quantity that is tightened, or the quantity that is normal. And then AQL uses these values to come back and give me a recommendation on, here's how many units you should test out of the sample. So in review, kind of going backwards to forwards. Let's say I didn't put in QC, or I didn't put in a specific QC module. Maybe I decided that, oh, I do have a need for QC Enterprise because I need first article inspection, or I want to leverage AQL. it's never too late. In fact, a lot of companies don't even put QCS in when they're doing their phase 1 of their ERP implementation, because there's a lot of moving parts just to QC, and sometimes it's deserving of its own little project, so it's never too late. Do I need enterprise? We just talked about that. Do you have a requirement for FAI? Do you have a requirement for AQL? Beyond that, do you have or want a solution for managing quality assurance within your organization for methodologies? Who inspected this? So within QC, I am required, when I do an inspection, required to say not only what inspector inspected and dispositioned a particular receiver, but even when they're doing testing, what inspector, and it could be a different inspector, performed the testing. And where do I set up inspectors? Well, the good news is you don't have to set up a separate table for inspectors. They are your employees. It uses the employee table. Can QC control shipping? Yes, it can control shipping, but the caveat there is if you're using pick, pack, ship. If you're using pick, pack, ship, then all the limitation within QC will be leveraged to control whether you have a COC on hand before pick, pack, ship will allow you to ship the material, the customer order line. And there is built-in instrument calibration management within QC. And it's fully integrated with your CSI ERP solution. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Elsa, to see if anyone has any questions.
All right, let's see. This time it does not look like we have any questions. Go ahead and share some of our poll results there. So we have one person who is not using. Do the first one. And we have one who is using. All right, it's kind of a mixed audience here.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I gave some information that you can use either to determine if you should be or want to be using QCS, or if you need to expand your usage of QCS. We're always here willing to help. So I want to thank you for your attention on this webinar. Elsa, you want to talk about the upcoming webinars?
Sure. As you may have seen, this is our second webinar in our 5-part CSI web series. So part 3 will be on March 26th, and that one will be reviewing Factory Track. Part 4 is on April 17th. We'll cover Burst. And then part 5, wrapping up the series, will be on May 14th, and that will do a nice overview of the CSI tech stack. Also, I'd like to put a plug in there for SUN. The CSI National User Conference is April 6th through 8th in Orlando. If you have not signed up or you are not a member of SUN yet, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's a user group run by users for users. So I know many of our customers who are part of SUN have nothing but good things to say, and they learn a lot and get a lot of their questions answered regarding to CSI and all sorts of issues. So with that, we will wrap it up. This presentation has been recorded, and once we get it downloaded, I will send it out either later today or first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you for part 3. Thank you, Helmuth.
All right. Thanks, everybody.